Hi, my name's Jack, and I've been writing my master's thesis for the past 2 years. But in order to graduate, I need to present my work to the public. Its title is Framing Inequality and Redistribution in a Crisis, an analysis of Australian print media's framing of economic inequality and progressive taxation policies during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was one or two characters under the allowable limit. I've gone ahead and summarised some of the main ideas for you in roughly 11 minutes. To start with, inequality can take many forms. Here, we are solely interested in economic inequality, which is often measured by differences in the distribution of income and wealth between households. In very simple terms, economic inequality is the gap between the richest and poorest in society. There is evidence that this gap has in fact been growing since the year 1300, only to be temporarily reduced via state intervention during notable periods of crisis. The most notable period of reduction being from the start of World War I to the mid-1970s, a period preceded by two world wars and the Great Depression. These events have been referred to as shocks that resulted in governments implementing policies that significantly redistributed wealth and income. This redistribution came primarily through progressive tax reforms, such as the introduction of progressive income tax and inheritance tax. These reforms resulted in the strengthening of the welfare state and a social safety net for citizens. However, since the 1980s, a reversal has taken place, and once again, wealth and income inequality has been trending upward within almost all developed countries. This increase has coincided with another trend, a consistent reduction of top tax rates. Most attribute this to a shift to a more neoliberal global order during the late 1970s and 80s, with markets reclaimed to more efficiently deliver well-being to society. Think Reagan and Thatcher. Thus, an ideological attempt was made to separate the political from the economic. Now, several measures of inequality are approaching or have already surpassed pre-World War I levels, the time when wealth concentration was thought to be previously at its highest. The question now is whether COVID-19 is a big enough crisis to result in similar significant tax reform. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly amplified the debate on economic inequality and redistributive policies. Whilst the majority of global citizens were negatively affected in varying ways, the world's richest saw their wealth surge to unprecedented levels. Additionally, governments implemented measures aimed at containing the virus in an attempt to ensure the sustainability of health systems. As a result, government budgets experienced record deficits and levels of debt due to public spending efforts to keep economies afloat, somewhat reminiscent of the response to the 2007-08 global financial crisis. To raise revenue, many organisations and political parties proposed increasing taxes on their country's wealthiest as a viable policy option. However, past attempts to soak the rich and increase taxes on the wealthy have been met with stiff resistance. A growing literature on how redistributive policies have been covered in the news media show various frames have been used to stoke fear of negative economic consequences, such as potential harm to growth, jobs, innovation, and the overall material interests of the public. This is despite the same media genuinely recognizing inequality as a serious problem. It is important to consider how such issues are being framed in the media, because the media plays a pivotal role in providing the average person information on economic issues that, without their help, they would otherwise not be privy to. It is especially important given most citizens' beliefs about the extent of inequality, where they sit in the income distribution, and the level of top tax rates are often wrong when compared to objective reality. My paper looked at 216 articles from Australia's two national daily newspapers, The Australian and the Australian Financial Review, between 11th of March 2020 to the end of 2021. The start date was chosen because the 11th of March 2020 was the day the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a worldwide pandemic. Australia provides a unique case study to investigate because, like the rest of the world, Australia's billionaires disproportionately benefited from the pandemic, particularly in mining and tech industries. Also, Australia is one of 17 OECD countries that does not levy wealth taxes, and only 1 of 4 that do not levy inheritance, estate, or gift taxes. Additionally, in the lead up to the 2022 federal election, the Greens, Australia's fourth largest political party, promised to introduce a billionaires tax and a corporate super profits tax, stirring up media attention. Before delving into the results, let's take a brief look at one example of how inequality has been trending in Australia. Income inequality has been steadily rising since the early 1980s. At this point, the top 10% of earners' share of national income was just below 25%. It then reached 30% around the year 2000 and was sitting near 34% as of 2021. In contrast, the share of income for the bottom 50% of earners neared 20% in the late 1970s, but has since fallen to 16% as of 2021. Atkinson and Lee attribute much of the increase of the top 1 and 10% share of income to the rise of Australian CEO salaries during the 1990s, as well as top marginal tax rates falling from 69% in 1970 down to 47% by 1990. Coming back to framing for a minute, framing is an important theory within communication and media studies. While there exist many ideas of what exactly framing means, one commonly accepted idea is that communicative texts use a central organizing storyline in order to assign meaning and make sense of relevant events. Chong and Druckmann have a complementary definition that highlights the idea of salience, that is, to make something prominent. They posit that an author frames an issue by encouraging readers or listeners to emphasize certain considerations above others when evaluating that issue. A framing effect occurs when individuals arrive at different positions on the same issue, depending on the priority given to various considerations. The surprisingly limited number of studies that have looked at how economic inequality has been framed in the news media has found arguments are generally based around 2 primary considerations. First, whether current levels of inequality are fair or unfair. That is, whether the uneven distribution of wealth or income has come about in a fair or just way. For example, wealth is earned through hard work or innovation, or perhaps wealth is depicted as a result of inheritance or corruption. The second primary consideration is whether the consequences of inequality are positive or negative, meaning even if distribution is fair, a frame may depict the current or future consequences of inequality as a greater concern. For example, the negative social or political consequences of inequality may be highlighted. Or, it may be argued inequality, though not ideal, leads to better economic consequences for all, such as greater innovation. One can see, depending on how a news article chooses to frame the issue, the article will problematize or legitimize the issue to the reader. Of course, it's not often a straight line, with the possibility of numerous competing frames within individual articles. This means a neutral framing is also a valid outcome if both sides of the argument is presented equally. Overall, a literature review of the topic found the majority of news media has typically deployed frames that portray the issue as problematic. Despite this, and as already mentioned, the media has also often framed progressive tax reforms, a recognized solution to reduce inequality, in a cautious and somewhat hostile way. So what about Australia then? My findings revealed Australia's 2 national daily newspapers overwhelmingly problematised the issue of economic inequality, which is consistent with the literature. What was unique to Australia was that capitalism and the process of how income and wealth distribution has come about in a market economy somewhat dominated the discussion. The second most frequently used line of argumentation framed the uneven distribution of wealth and income as fair, and thus legitimate when distributed via a market economy. This was, however, second to the exact opposite framing. In the most frequently observed framing then, markets were often depicted as imperfect, inefficient, prone to monopolization, and heavily criticized the neoliberal US-style winner-takes-all capitalist approach. This discourse is a sign of a seemingly healthy discussion in the Australian media with regards to inequality. With regards to progressive taxation policies, overall, the two newspapers portrayed a fairly balanced mix of articles that both endorsed and rejected progressive tax policies. The introduction of an inheritance tax was discussed the most and was also the most frequently endorsed, despite also facing some pushback. Reducing tax breaks for the wealthy, a land tax, and closing tax loopholes were policies that were overwhelmingly endorsed by the Australian media. Meanwhile, increasing corporate tax rates was never endorsed, and stamp duty, which is currently levied, was overwhelmingly rejected. The need to finance public revenue and spending was by far the most frequently used argument to endorse progressive tax policy reform during this period. If the Australian public were to be rallied in support of progressive tax reform, these findings show politicians may face less resistance from the media if they proposed any of the above endorsed policies and promoted them as a necessary revenue-raising exercise. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, I appreciate you. All references are available from my thesis, and if one fancies a quiet night in of reading, one can access it by copying down this link and pasting it into a web browser.